the poorest girl in town, the richest man in the region, and a decision that enrages the entire valley. As Colt Mercer walked past the elegantly dressed widows and extended his hand toward Elena Ashcroft, a woman in patched clothes, her hands calloused from labor, laughter erupted everywhere. They thought it was a joke. They were wrong. What they didn't know was that Elena wouldn't just save that farm, she would change the entire valley forever. Like, comment the city you're watching so I know how far my story has come. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episodes. The morning Colt Mercer came to town looking for a wife, every woman in Harlan's Crossing had already decided it would be her. Word had spread fast, the way word always spread in a place with too little to do and too much time to do it. Someone at the feed store had overheard something that someone told the blacksmith's wife. The blacksmith's wife told her sister. By the time the sun had cleared the eastern ridgeline and the dust on the main road was still cool and dark from the night, half the town knew that Colt Mercer, owner of the Broken Spur Ranch, 340 acres of hard-won land on the valley's western slope, was coming into Harlan's Crossing to find himself a partner. Not just a wife, a partner. That was the word people kept repeating because it was the strange part, the part nobody quite knew what to do with. Mabel Crow heard it and immediately sent her housekeeper to press her second-best dress. Dora Whitfield, who had buried 2 husbands and considered herself an expert on the subject of men, spent an extra hour on her hair. Adelaide Foss, the youngest of the 3 and the one who laughed loudest at other people's misfortunes, put on her jade earrings and told her cook she wouldn't be home for lunch. They were the wealthiest women in Harlan's Crossing. They owned property. They had influence. They had the kind of names that meant something in the county, names attached to the right families, the right histories. When they walked into a room, people made space. None of them gave a single thought to Elena Ashcroft. Why would they? Elena was 23 years old and lived alone in a 2-room house at the north end of town, on the patch of land her father had left her when he died. Land so rocky and dry it couldn't grow much more than stubborn weeds and regret. She had no family left that claimed her, no savings to speak of, no standing in any circle that mattered to the women who ran Harlan's Crossing's social machinery. She owned 3 dresses, 2 of which were patched at the elbows and hem. She worked wherever work was offered, hauling water from the creek for old Franklin's widow, mucking out stalls at the livery when the regular hand was sick, splitting wood in the cold mornings for anyone who'd pay her 50 cents. People in town weren't cruel to Elena exactly. Cruelty required a kind of sustained attention that most of them couldn't be bothered to give her. They just didn't see her as a person who mattered much. She was part of the background of Harlan's Crossing, like the broken-down fence at the edge of the church lot, or the dried-up fountain in the center of the square that nobody had bothered to fix in 4 years. Mabel Crow had once said, loudly, at a church social, that it was a shame about the Ashcroft girl, that her father had been a decent man but had clearly left nothing behind worth inheriting. The comment had floated through the room, and nobody had argued with it because nobody felt strongly enough to bother. Elena had heard about it 2 days later from the blacksmith's wife, who had told her with a careful expression that was meant to convey sympathy, but mostly conveyed satisfaction at having information to deliver. Elena had said thank you, gone home, and spent that evening sharpening the axe she used for splitting wood. She wasn't the kind of person who cried in front of other people. She wasn't sure she was the kind of person who cried at all anymore. There had been a time when her father was sick and the money was running out and the nights were very long, when she'd been afraid that grief was going to swallow her whole. It hadn't. She was still here. That had to count for something, even if nobody else was counting. She was at the livery that morning cleaning out the back stalls when she heard the commotion outside. The horse she was working near, a big gray gelding that the owner, Hitch Gallagher, called Smoke, had been skittish for 3 days. Hitch had given up on him after the horse had kicked a wall hard enough to crack 2 boards and nearly taken off the finger of the last stable hand who'd tried to work near him. Nobody was sure what had set Smoke off. Hitch thought maybe he'd been spooked by something on his last ride out, a snake or a dog, or some loud noise in the brush. Whatever it was, the horse was wound up tight and hadn't calmed down. Elena had been working around him for 2 hours, not trying to touch him, not making direct eye contact, just moving slowly through her business and talking in a low, even voice about nothing in particular. She talked about the weather. She talked about the price of feed corn. She talked at one point for a solid 10 minutes about the way the creek sounded different depending on where you stood on the bank. It wasn't a technique she'd read anywhere. It was just something she'd learned from watching her father with difficult animals when she was small. "You're not trying to convince them," he told her once. "You're just letting them know you're not going anywhere. That's all they need to know." She was thinking about that when the noise outside got loud enough to pull her attention to the livery doors. She could hear women's voices, high and excited, and the sound of a wagon coming down the main road at a careful pace. She stepped out into the sunlight, squinting. Colt Mercer's wagon was moving slowly past the storefronts. He was driving it himself. No ranch hand up front, no foreman, just the man himself, sitting straight-backed on the seat, with the reins easy in his hands. He was somewhere around 40, maybe a year or two past it, with a broad-shouldered build that spoke of a man who still worked his own land. His hair was dark, with threads of gray at the temples. His face had the look of a man who'd spent most of his life outdoors, not unhandsome but marked by it, the skin around his eyes creased from squinting into too many bright mornings. Elena had seen him before, the way you saw everyone in a town this size. He'd passed through the livery once or twice. She'd served him coffee once at the diner when they'd been short-handed. He'd said thank you in the way people said it when they meant it, not just as a noise. And she'd noticed that because it wasn't as common as it should have been. Mabel Crow was already at the edge of the boardwalk, Adelaide Foss just behind her, both of them arranged in poses that they probably weren't aware were poses. Dora Whitfield was coming out of the milliner's shop across the street, walking fast. There was a cluster of other women, too, wives and daughters of the better-off families, and a few merchants who'd come out to watch because the prospect of Colt Mercer choosing a wife was the most interesting thing that had happened in Harlan's Crossing since the attempted bank robbery 3 months back, which had mostly been interesting because of how badly it had failed. Colt pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the general store. He climbed down with the ease of a man who'd done it 10,000 times. He looked at the assembled faces on the boardwalk for a moment, and something in his expression, not rude exactly, but honest, told Elena he was doing a kind of quiet accounting. "Morning," he said, to no one and everyone. Mabel Crow stepped forward. She had a way of moving that assumed people would clear space for her, and in Harlan's Crossing, they generally did. "Mr. Mercer," she said, smiling in the way she smiled when she wanted something, "we've been hearing you're looking for some company out on the Broken Spur." Colt looked at her. "I'm looking for a partner," he said, "somebody willing to work. The ranch is struggling, and I need someone who understands that's the situation. Not somebody looking to marry into something comfortable, because there isn't anything comfortable about it right now." Mabel's smile didn't waver. "I'm sure there are many women here who could offer you what you're looking for." "I'm sure," he said. It was not quite agreement. He went into the general store. Elena, who had no particular reason to stand in the street watching a man buy supplies, went back into the livery. What? She found out later from 3 different people who each told her slightly different versions of the same story. What had happened in the hour that followed. Mabel Crow had found reasons to linger near the general store. Dora Whitfield had gone in, claiming she needed thread, and had managed to corner Colt near the dry goods shelves for long enough to inform him that she owned 60 acres south of town and knew how to manage a household. Adelaide Foss had invited him to come see her property, which she described as prosperous, which was mostly true if you ignored the mortgage that her second husband had left her. Colt had been polite to all of them. He'd listened. He'd answered questions when questions were asked. And then he'd loaded his wagon with his supplies: salt, coffee, a length of rope, a new file for sharpening tools, and he'd driven the wagon slowly up the main road. He'd stopped in front of the livery. Elena was inside, still working, when she heard the wagon. She came to the doors because she thought Hitch might have a customer, and she'd need to step aside. Instead, she found Colt Mercer looking at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read, something measuring about it, but not unkind. "I heard you've been working with that gray horse," he said, "the one that's been giving Gallagher fits." Elena looked at him for a moment. "He's calmed down some. Hitch told me nobody else would go near him." "He's not dangerous," she said. "He's just scared." Colt was quiet for a moment, like he was turning something over. Then he said, "You're Elena Ashcroft." Yes. I'm Colt Mercer. I have a ranch on the western slope that's in a bad way. I need someone willing to work alongside me to bring it back. It won't be easy, and I can't offer comfort. What I can offer is honest partnership, shared labor, and a fair share of whatever we manage to build. She stared at him. You're asking me? I am. You were just talking to half the women in this town. I was, he said, and I'm talking to you now. She looked at him for a long time. She was trying to find the angle, the trick, the part where this turned into something she'd recognize. It didn't turn into anything. He just stood there, patient, waiting, with the expression of a man who'd made his decision and was comfortable with it. I need to think, she said. All right. Come back in an hour. He did. She said yes. Mkushi. The reaction in Harlan's Crossing was not what anyone could call restrained. Mabel Crow, when she heard, went very still in the way that meant she was furious underneath the stillness. She said nothing for a moment, and then she said, He can't be serious. Dora Whitfield laughed, a short, sharp sound that wasn't funny. The Ashcroft girl. He'd be better off hiring a ranch hand. Adelaide Foss said what several others were thinking but hadn't yet put into words. She's after the land. She has nothing, and she sees an opportunity. Poor Colt. I hope someone warns him before it's too late. That version, Elena as calculating, Elena as opportunistic, Elena as a pauper hunting for a soft landing, spread through Harlan's Crossing with the particular speed of stories that made people feel confirmed in what they'd already suspected. By evening, it was settled fact in most of the town's better kitchens that the Ashcroft girl had somehow tricked Colt Mercer into proposing to her, that she had designs on his land, and that this would end badly for everyone. Elena heard none of this directly. She heard it the way she always heard things, sideways, in the careful pauses of people who thought she might not understand what they were implying. She was at the dry goods store 2 days later, buying a small amount of salt and a needle, when Mrs. Elbert, wife of the county clerk, a woman who prided herself on her frankness, looked at her over the counter and said, I hope you know what you're getting into, dear. A ranch in that kind of trouble isn't anyone's idea of a good situation. I know, Elena said. And of course, people are talking. People were talking before, Elena said. The topics just change, Mrs. Elbert gave her a look that contained several layers of meaning, none of which Elena had time to fully excavate because she needed to get back to the Broken Spur before sundown. She paid for her goods and left. The Broken Spur was in worse shape than she'd expected, and she'd expected bad. The main barn roof had a section that had partially caved in after a winter storm. The damage repaired only enough to keep it from falling further, but not enough to actually fix it. 3 of the 4 fence lines on the north pasture needed new posts. The well pump was stiff and slow, pulling water with a grinding reluctance that suggested it was months away from failing completely. The bunkhouse, where the ranch hands slept, smelled of mildew and had a fireplace flue so blocked with old debris that anyone who tried to use it would fill the room with smoke. There were 4 ranch hands still on the property when Elena arrived. 2 of them, brothers named Ira and Cal, both young, both capable-looking, watched her walk through the property with Colt without expression. A third, an older man named Pete, who wore his hat so low it was hard to see his eyes, found reasons to be busy elsewhere whenever she came near. The fourth, a lean, weathered man called Webb, who served as the foreman, nodded at her once and seemed to be reserving judgment. Colt showed her everything without apology or softening. This was the roof situation. This was the fence situation. This was the pump. This was the cattle count, which was 24 fewer than it should have been after the previous winter's losses. This was the ledger, laid open on the kitchen table, 2 years of difficult numbers written in Colt's cramped handwriting. I need to understand why you're asking me, Elena said that first evening. They were at the kitchen table. Colt had made coffee. Not good coffee, but hot. And there was the ledger between them and the lamp turned up. I told you already. You told me you needed someone willing to work. That describes a lot of people. Colt looked at her. You calmed that horse down, he said. Hitch has been trying for 3 days. 2 of his hands refused to work near him. You walked in and spent a morning talking to him about creek water, and now he's eating normally. You want me to explain more than that? It's a horse. It's a way of looking at a problem, Colt said. Most people look at a horse that's acting wrong and they see the behavior. You saw what was underneath it. He closed the ledger. This ranch has been acting wrong for 2 years. I need somebody who can see what's underneath. Elena drank her coffee. It really was not good. She thought she could do something about that at least. I need to know what the arrangement is, she said. Clearly. Equal say in decisions, shared work. Whatever we bring in, split fair. If the ranch turns around, you have a stake in it. If it doesn't, he paused. I won't lie to you. If it doesn't, we've both lost something. And the personal arrangement. Colt was quiet a moment. We're engaged as of yesterday. The town knows it. I think we should be honest with each other from the start about what that is and what it isn't. What it is. 2 people who've agreed to try to build something together. What it isn't. Me pretending I know you, and you pretending this is a love story. That might come. It might not. I'm not going to promise what I can't guarantee. Elena found this so unlike what she'd been prepared for that she had to sit with it for a moment. That's more honest than most people bother to be, she said. I've found dishonesty to be a time-wasting exercise. All right, she said. Then I'll tell you something honest in return. Go ahead. I don't care what Harlan's Crossing thinks of me. I stopped caring some time ago, and I don't plan to start again. But I want you to know that I'm not here for the land. I'm not after anything except work I can be proud of. If you ever start to believe what they're saying about me out there, I need you to come to me directly and say it. Don't let it sit. Colt held her gaze. Same for me, he said. If I'm doing something wrong, say it. Deal. They shook hands, there at the kitchen table with the bad coffee cooling between them, which was probably not how most engagements in Harlan's Crossing started, but then again, most things about this one were going to be different from the start. She started with the pump. It was the kind of decision that made practical sense. Water was the most immediate need, the foundation everything else rested on. But it was also the kind of quiet choice that nobody would notice, which suited her fine. She asked Colt where the old tool chest was. She asked Ira, the more talkative of the brothers, if anyone had taken the pump apart in the last year. He looked at her like she'd asked if anyone had recently flown to the moon. Nobody's touched it, he said. All right. She took the pump apart over 2 days, working in the early mornings before the heat got bad, carefully laying out every piece in the order she removed it so she could put them back the same way. She found a leather washer so dried and cracked it had essentially stopped doing its job. She found a section of pipe where the joint had corroded and was allowing air in. She found the problem and she fixed it, using scraps of leather from the barn and a proper pipe fitting from Colt's supply shelf that had been sitting unused long enough to gather dust. When the pump came back together and pulled water with a smooth, even resistance, Ira stood watching with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not impressed exactly. Something more like recalibration. Where'd you learn to do that? He asked. My father, she said. It was true. Her father had been the kind of man who believed you should understand the things you depended on. Plumbing, carpentry, animal care, basic ironwork. He'd shown her as much as he could before his health had gone. She wasn't an expert in any of it, but she knew how to take something apart and look at it honestly, and most of the time that was more than half the battle. Webb, the foreman, had been watching from across the yard. He said nothing that day. 2 days later he came to her and said without preamble, the north fence. Post-rot. I've been telling Colt for 6 months. He keeps saying he'll get to it. Show me, Elena said. They walked the fence line together, Webb pointing out each failing post, Elena looking and counting. 17 posts. Not all of them gone yet, but going. She and Webb worked that fence for 4 days, pulling and replacing, while Colt was occupied with a cattle count and renegotiating a grazing agreement with a neighboring spread. Webb worked without talking much, which suited Elena. She talked when talking was useful and was quiet when it wasn't. At the end of the 4th day, Webb sat down on the finished fence line and looked at the repaired posts with the expression of someone who'd been waiting a long time for a thing to get done. You know what you're doing, he said. Sometimes, Elena said. Not always. Better than the last 2 people Colt brought in, Webb said. First one left after 3 weeks. Said the work was too hard. Second one tried to renegotiate his terms after he arrived, and Colt showed him the door. "What about you?" Elena said. "Why do you stay?" Webb looked at the fence a moment. "I've been here 11 years, he said. "I've seen this land when it was good and when it wasn't. I believe it can be good again." He glanced at her. "Now I'm less sure it'll kill us all trying." Elena decided she liked Webb. He'd earned the right to that opinion. The abandoned north pasture was where she had what Colt later called, in one of his rare moments of extended speech, her first real idea. The pasture had been fallow for 2 years. Colt had written it off after a section of the fence had collapsed, and some of the cattle had gotten into the neighboring property and caused enough damage that the relationship with that neighbor, a man named Horace Kundle, sour and litigious, had curdled entirely. It was easier, Colt had decided, to keep the cattle in the southern pastures and pretend the north one didn't exist. Elena walked it one evening after the fence work was done. The grass was overgrown in some parts, dead and compacted in others. But she noticed something. The soil in the lower end of the pasture was darker, damper. There was a natural drainage slope she could see in the way the ground lay, and at the bottom of that slope, half buried in a thicket of volunteer brush, she found the remnants of an old water channel. Someone had dug it, years ago, to redirect some of the spring runoff. The channel had silted in and been forgotten. She went back and found Colt in the barn. "The north pasture," she said. He looked up from what he was doing. "What about it?" "There's an old water channel down at the lower end. If we clear it and restore the slope, we can get runoff into the lower section. The grass there is actually better than it looks. The roots are still alive, they're just not getting water. If we graze it in rotation, move the cattle through in thirds, let each section rest, we could double our usable grazing land without spending much." Colt put down his tool. He gave her the look he'd been developing, the one that was trying to figure out where she'd come from. "How do you know the roots are still alive?" She picked up a handful of dirt from the floor, held it up, then realized she'd just picked up barn floor dirt, which was not illustrative of her point. She put it back down. "Because the soil is dark in the lower section. Dark soil holds moisture. If the ground were truly dead, it would be gray and compacted all the way down. You've done rotational grazing before?" "My father had 20 acres. We had to be creative." She paused. "I know 20 acres isn't 300. "No," Colt said, "but the principal doesn't care about acreage." They started on the channel the next morning. What? The horses were the thing that shifted something in the broader picture. 3 of the Broken Spurs horses had been difficult since Elena arrived. Not aggressive, exactly, but resistant, unreliable, the kind of unpredictable that made ranch work harder than it needed to be. She'd been working around them the way she worked around most problems, quietly, without making it a project, just spending time near them when she had time to spare. 2 weeks in, she was able to bridle all 3 without incident. One of them, a black mare with a white star on her forehead that Pete called Ghost, had been refusing the saddle for so long that Pete had essentially stopped trying. Elena spent 3 days just putting the saddle blanket on and taking it back off again, over and over, until the mare stopped caring about it. Then she started with the saddle itself, same process. The day Ghost accepted the saddle and stood quietly, Pete was watching from the fence. He walked over slowly, hands in his pockets, hat still pulled low. He looked at the horse. He looked at Elena. He said, "My cousin trained horses down in Texas. He said the secret was patience so deep it felt like you didn't care anymore." "Your cousin was right," Elena said. "He was a hard man to like," Pete said. "But he knew horses." He paused. "You want some help with the barn roof? I used to do carpentry work before I came here." "I'd appreciate it," Elena said. After that, Pete stopped finding reasons to be elsewhere when she was working nearby. The town's reaction to all of this was complicated, which was to say, they didn't see most of it, and what they did see, they interpreted through what they'd already decided to believe. The narrative in Harlan's Crossing had settled, by the end of the first week, into something fairly rigid. Elena Ashcroft had somehow attached herself to Colt Mercer out of calculation. He was a good man who'd made a poor decision. Eventually, he'd see through her, and then she'd be back where she started, and the natural order of things would be restored. Mabel Crow was the center of gravity for this version of events. She held a Wednesday afternoon tea, a regular gathering that functioned, in practice, as the headquarters for managing the town's social conclusions. And at this tea, she said with great apparent concern that she'd heard from a reliable source that the Ashcroft girl had never run a household, had no experience with ranch work, and that Colt's hands were already unhappy with the situation. None of this was true. Mabel's reliable source was Adelaide Foss, who had driven past the broken spur once and seen Elena in the yard and decided from that distance that she looked out of place. But in Harlan's Crossing, a story told with confidence in the right room was almost as good as a story that was true. Elena heard about the Wednesday teas third hand, from the same blacksmith's wife who'd once delivered Mabel's comment about her father. She listened without expression, thanked the woman for telling her, and went home. That evening she sat at the kitchen table across from Colt and said, "Mabel Crow is telling people your hands are unhappy with me." Colt looked up. "Are they?" "I don't think so, but you should ask them directly." He did the next morning, standing in the yard with all four of them. He asked straight out, "Any problems? Any concerns? Anyone want to say something? Now was the time." Pete said, "She fixed the pump." Webb said, "She worked that fence for 4 days without a complaint." Ira said slowly, "I think she might know what she's doing." Cal, who had not spoken directly to Elena in 2 weeks, said nothing for a moment, then said, "I don't have a problem with her." Colt nodded. "Good," he said. "Then we're all on the same page." He didn't mention Mabel Crow by name. He didn't need to. The first time someone in town was actively rude to Elena's face, rather than through the safe medium of gossip, was on a Saturday market morning, 3 weeks after she'd come to the Broken Spur. She'd come in to pick up supplies and to find out whether the hardware merchant still had the length of pipe fitting she needed for the drainage channel project. The market was busy. She moved through it efficiently, the way she'd always moved through public spaces, without stopping, without lingering, keeping to the edges. Adelaide Foss found her near the vegetable stalls. "Elena," Adelaide said, loudly enough for the nearest 3 stalls to hear, "I heard you've been working on Colt's water system. I hope you know what you're doing. It would be awful if you made things worse." The women nearby were watching without appearing to watch. "I fixed the pump," Elena said. "The water channel project starts next week." "Well," Adelaide said, in the voice of someone bestowing patience on someone who doesn't deserve it, "I suppose you have to do something to earn your keep, don't you? Since it's certainly not—" She stopped and smiled, letting the pause do the work. Elena looked at her. She was aware of the watching faces, the held breath, the anticipation. She felt briefly the old anger. Not hot, not sharp, but a low, steady thing she'd been managing since she was 17 years old, and had first understood exactly what this town thought of her. She said, "I think the radishes here look good this week." She bought the radishes. She paid for them, thanked the vendor, and walked away. Behind her, she heard Adelaide say something that got a small laugh from the nearest stalls. She didn't look back. She found the pipe fitting she needed. She went home. That evening, she was quiet at dinner. Colt noticed, because he noticed most things, but he didn't push it. They ate in a silence that was not entirely comfortable, which was better than a conversation that made things worse. Finally, he said, "Bad day in town?" "Adelaide Foss," Elena said. He nodded slowly. He looked like he was choosing his words. "She's been a problem before," he said. "Not to me directly, but she's the kind of person who needs someone to be beneath her. If it wasn't you, it'd be someone else." "I know," Elena said. "Doesn't make it easier." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." He poured more coffee. Still not good, she was working up to addressing this, and said, "You know you don't have to stay. I mean that. If this is costing you more than it's worth, that's something I need to know." Elena put her fork down. She looked at him. "I'm not leaving," she said. "I want that to be clear. Not because of Adelaide Foss, not because of Mabel Crow, not because the whole town thinks I'm here for your land. I'm here because I said I would be, and because this work is worth doing." She picked her fork back up. "But thank you for asking." Colt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The coffee's bad." "I know," she said. "I've been meaning to talk to you about that." Something in his expression shifted, very slightly. Not quite a smile, but in the direction of one. "Be my guest," he said. It was a small thing, hardly worth noting, but small things had a way of adding up, and Elena had always understood that the only way to build anything real was to start with what you had in front of you. Outside, the broken spur sat quiet in the evening dark, the fence lines holding, the pump running clean, the north pasture waiting for the water channel that would bring it back. There was a long way to go, she knew that. The whole valley could see she knew that. She was still here. The coffee improved first. It was a small thing, but small things had a way of marking time on a ranch. In the morning, Elena quietly replaced Colt's habit of boiling grounds until they turned bitter with a proper steep and a pinch of salt to cut the edge. Webb came into the kitchen, took one sip, and set his cup down with an expression like a man who'd just remembered something he'd forgotten he missed. He didn't say anything. He just drank the whole cup standing up, which was not his usual habit, and that was comment enough. The water channel came next. It took 11 days, working in the mornings before the heat peaked, and again in the evenings when it broke. Elena and Webb did most of it, with Ira helping on the days when his other work allowed. Cal kept his distance, not hostile, just watchful in the way of someone who hadn't finished making up his mind. They cleared the silted channel by hand, following the old line where it still showed, deepening and widening the worst sections, reinforcing the sides with flat stones pulled from the pasture's edge, where they'd been sitting useless since someone cleared them years ago. The first time the spring runoff moved down the channel and pooled in the lower pasture, spreading dark and quiet into the dry ground, Elena stood at the top of the slope and watched it go. It wasn't dramatic. Water didn't applaud itself. It just moved where the ground allowed it, and the ground took it in. "Huh," said Ira, standing beside her. "Yeah," she said. Within 2 weeks, the lower section of the north pasture was showing green. Not lush. The ground had been dry too long for lush, but the pale, determined green of grass deciding to come back. Colt rotated the first third of the cattle through it on a Tuesday and stood at the fence watching them graze with his hands in his pockets and a look on his face that Elena had learned to read as his version of relief. "You were right about the roots," he said. "I'm right about things sometimes," she said. "More than sometimes," he said, and walked back to work, which was the closest Colt Mercer got to a speech. Things on the ranch were imperfect and difficult and frequently exhausting, and they were getting better. That was the honest summary of those weeks. The barn roof still had a weak section that Pete was working through, slowly, on the days when carpentry was possible around the rest of his duties. The cattle count was still lower than it should have been. The relationship with Horace Cundall, their litigious neighbor to the north, remained cold enough that any fence work near the property line had to be done with careful attention to the boundary markers, because Cundall watched that line like a man with a grievance he was looking for an excuse to exercise. But the pump ran clean. The north pasture was coming back. The horses were manageable. Webb had started bringing his problems to Elena as often as he brought them to Colt, not because he'd transferred his loyalty, but because he'd decided she was worth consulting, which was its own kind of thing. And in Harlan's Crossing, none of this was visible. What was visible was Elena on her supply runs, which she kept short and businesslike. What was visible was the engagement, which the town had processed and moved past into the more comfortable territory of waiting for it to fail. What was visible, or rather, what was being constructed in the absence of actual visibility, was the story Mabel Crow and Adelaide Foss were telling at Wednesday teas and across merchant counters and in the low voices of women walking together on the boardwalk. The story went, the hands were unhappy. The story went, Colt was too proud to admit he'd made a mistake. The story went, it was only a matter of time. Elena heard these things. She heard them the way she heard most of the town's opinions of her, at a distance, filtered through people who delivered the information with a particular expression that tried to be sympathetic and mostly communicated something closer to satisfaction. She heard them and she went back to the ranch and she worked. What she didn't see coming was the Tuesday morning when she arrived at the feed merchant's and found that his prices had changed, not for everyone, just for the Broken Spurs account. The merchant, a heavy-set man named Garvey, with a way of not quite meeting her eyes, told her that he'd had to recalculate his rates based on outstanding credit and risk assessment, which was a long way of saying the price of their feed corn had gone up by 30%. She asked him when this decision had been made. He said recently. She asked if he'd notified Colt directly. He said he was notifying them now. She bought what they needed at the new rate because she had no immediate alternative, and she drove back to the ranch and told Colt. He was quiet while she talked. He had a particular quality of stillness when he was angry, not the cold stillness of a man suppressing something dangerous, but the focused stillness of a man running through his options before he spoke. Garvey's been our feed supplier for 6 years, he said. I know. Did he give you any reason that made sense? No, she said. He gave me a reason that sounded like a reason. They looked at each other across the kitchen table. The coffee was good now. That was something. It's them, Colt said. Not a question. I think so, Elena said. I don't have proof. But Garvey's not a man who takes risks on his own. Someone convinced him this was worth doing. Colt pushed back from the table and went outside. She heard him in the yard, not shouting, just moving, the way he moved when he needed to think with his body. She stayed at the table and worked through the numbers. 30% on feed was significant, but not catastrophic if they could find an alternative supplier. There was a merchant in the next town over, 15 miles east. She'd never dealt with him. She didn't know his prices or his reliability. That was the start of it. Within a week, the problems began arriving from multiple directions, which was the tell. Isolated difficulties happened on their own, but coordinated ones came in clusters. One of the neighboring ranches declined to honor a long-standing agreement to allow the Broken Spurs cattle to use a shared water point on the east boundary during dry stretches. The reason given was vague enough to be unassailable. Another neighbor, a quiet man named Birch, who ran sheep and had never had a problem with Colt in the years they'd been adjacent, sent word that he'd need to reposition his fence line, which had the effect of closing off a trail the Broken Spur had used for years to move cattle between the southern pastures. Then 3 sections of fence on the north pasture were cut, not broken by cattle pressure or collapsed from post-rot, cut cleanly, with wire cutters, in the night, leaving gaps wide enough for cattle to wander through. They found it on a Wednesday morning, Webb and Elena making the rounds before breakfast. The cuts were precise. Someone had known exactly where to make them for maximum effect. No cattle had gone through yet. The early morning check had caught it before the herd moved north. But it had been close. Webb stood looking at the cut wire with his hands on his hips and his hat pushed back on his head. He said something under his breath that wasn't suitable for polite company. I know, Elena said. This isn't a property dispute, Webb said. This is someone wanting to make a point. Yes. They repaired the fence that day. 2 days later, another section was cut, further west. Elena started doing late-night checks herself, walking the fence line with a lantern after the rest of the ranch was asleep. She found nothing on the first 2 nights, which meant either that whoever was doing it was watching or that they were moving to other methods. They were moving to other methods. Ira came to her on a Friday with the look of a man carrying information he wished he didn't have. The 2 hands Colt was trying to bring on from the Reardon spread, he said. They've pulled out. What did they say? Not much. Reardon told them there might not be much of a future in signing on with Broken Spur right now. He paused. Reardon doesn't usually talk like that. What did you say to them? Ira looked at his boots. I said the ranch was doing better than it had been. I said the north pasture was coming back. I said the work was hard, but it was honest. He looked up. I don't think they believed me. I think they'd already been told what to think. Elena thanked him and went to find Colt. She found him in the barn, working on a harness with the focused attention of a man who needed to do something with his hands. She told him what Ira had said. He listened. He kept working for a moment after she finished, pulling a stitch tight. Then he set the harness down. We need more hands, he said. If we're going to get the north pasture fully operational before summer ends, we need at least 2 more people. I know. And now we can't get them. Not from the usual places, she said, but Reardon and Birch and whoever else they've talked to. That's not every ranch in the valley. There are families in town who've lost work this year. The Holt family lost their crop. The Dawes family has 2 grown sons with nothing to do. Colt looked at her. You think they'd come? I think if we ask them directly, without going through the people who've been poisoning the water, some of them might. She paused. Let me talk to them. He was quiet for a moment. You sure you want to be the one? She understood what he was asking. She was the contested element. She was the one they'd been told to distrust. Sending her to recruit was a risk. I'm sure, she said. She went to the Holt house on a Saturday, which was when people were home and not at the market, which was where they'd be visible and therefore cautious. Thomas Holt met her at the door with the expression of a man who'd heard about her and hadn't decided what to do with what he'd heard. His wife was visible behind him in the kitchen doorway. I know what people have been saying, Elena told him before he could say anything guarded. I know what you've heard. I'm not here to argue with it or explain myself. The North Pasture at Broken Spur is coming back. We need 2 good workers for the summer run. The pay is fair and there's a meal at the end of every day. She gave him the rate. It was honest. That's all I came to say. Thomas Holt looked at her for a long time. His wife had moved closer to the doorway. He looked back at her, some private communication passing between them that Elena couldn't read, and then he looked back at Elena. My boy Samuel is 18, he said. He works hard. Is he reliable? He's reliable. Tell him to come by Monday morning, Elena said. The second hire came from the Dawes family, and it was more complicated. The older Dawes' son, Marcus, had clearly been told something about the situation at Broken Spur because he arrived on Monday morning with the careful expression of a man prepared to be disappointed. He was 22, broad-shouldered, quiet. He worked alongside Webb for a full day before Webb came to Elena that evening and said simply, He's good. It wasn't a smooth process. It wasn't a story about Elena Ashcroft winning people over through the force of her goodness. It was 2 people who needed work and 1 ranch that needed workers, and the economics of that were stronger than the gossip. Barely. Cal noticed something, 2 weeks in, that Elena might have missed if he hadn't come to her directly. He'd been the one she understood least, still watchful, still quieter than the others, the one whose opinion of her remained most opaque. He came to her one morning near the end of the 2nd week and said, without any preamble, the cattle that went missing in the spring. Elena looked at him. What about them? Colt wrote it off as winter loss, 24 head. Cal's jaw was set. I don't think it was weather. She waited. I was out on the east boundary last night, he said, checking the fence after the last cut. I found tracks. Not our horses. And there were marks in the grass where animals had been moved through fast, in the dark. He paused. Whoever's cutting fences and making our suppliers nervous, I think they've been at this longer than we thought. Elena felt something settle in her chest. Not fear exactly, but the cold clarity that comes with understanding that a problem is larger than you initially assessed. Did you show Colt? Not yet. Wanted to show you first. He said it without particular inflection, like it was a simple practical decision. It was, she realized, a statement of something that had shifted without announcement. Cal had made up his mind about her sometime in the past weeks, and this was how he expressed it. Show us both, she said. Tonight. They stood at the east fence line as the sun went down, all 3 of them, looking at marks in the grass that told a story nobody wanted confirmed. Colt crouched down and looked at the tracks for a long time without speaking. When he stood up, his face had the look it got when the stillness was working hard to contain something. I need to know who's behind this, he said. So do I, Elena said. But right now, tonight, what I need to know is where those cattle went and whether they're still in the valley. She was thinking out loud, which was something she didn't often do in front of people. But Colt listened, and Cal listened, and Webb, who had followed them out at a distance, came closer when he understood the conversation had turned serious. If they moved the cattle, Elena said, they didn't go far. Not in the dark, not without noise. There are only 3 canyon approaches on the east side, and 2 of them would have left more visible tracks. She looked at Cal. The 3rd? Dry creek bed, Cal said. About 2 miles out. Good cover. Easy to move animals through at night without being seen from the road. Then that's where we look, she said. Colt was watching her. You're not wrong, he said. I know I'm not wrong, she said, more sharply than she'd intended, and then, sorry. Don't apologize for being right, he said. It wastes time. They found, over the following 3 days of careful riding, not the cattle. Those were gone. Genuinely gone. Sold or moved far enough out of the county that recovery would require more than they currently had, but something more useful. They found the route, the specific path through the dry creek bed, the place where the ground had been disturbed by hooves in numbers, the location where someone had clearly waited with a wagon. And at that waiting place, half buried in the creek bed silt where it had fallen unnoticed in the dark, a single piece of paper, crumpled and water-stained but legible, with numbers on it that looked like a tally, and at the top, in handwriting that Elena stared at for a long time. 2 initials and a partial word she recognized. She didn't say what she thought she recognized. Not yet. She kept the paper, and she thought about it, and she added it to the quiet accounting she'd been running in her head since the first fence section was cut. The women who'd decided she was nothing had made one miscalculation from the start. They'd assumed that someone who had always been overlooked would be easy to overlook. They hadn't understood that spending your whole life being underestimated was, if you survived it, the best possible education in paying attention to the things other people couldn't be bothered to see. Elena paid attention. She was still paying attention, and the paper was in her pocket, and the north pasture was green, and the coffee was good, and the ranch was not going to be beaten by people who thought that cruelty organized in drawing rooms was stronger than work done in the honest dirt. She wasn't done yet. She kept the paper in the inside pocket of her work jacket, folded twice, the crease lines already softening from being handled too many times in the days that followed. She didn't show it to Colt again after that first night at the creek bed. She'd shown him enough to confirm what they both suspected, that the sabotage had been organized, paid for, running longer than either of them had wanted to believe. What she hadn't told him was the partial word at the top of the tally sheet. 3 letters visible through the water stain, FOS. The rest was gone, blurred into the paper's pulp by whatever water had gotten to it in the creek bed. It wasn't proof. She knew what proof looked like, because her father had once spent 8 months trying to recover a debt from a man who owed him money, and he taught her the difference between knowing something and being able to do something with what you knew. What she had was a strong suspicion pointed in a direction she'd been looking for weeks, which was not nothing, but wasn't enough. So she kept working and she kept thinking, and she watched Adelaide Foss the way you watched a weather system. Without drama, just attention, cataloging the signs. What she noticed was that Adelaide had money that didn't entirely match her stated circumstances. Her late husband's estate had been modest, her acreage was mortgaged, and yet she kept a housekeeper, dressed well, and had recently, according to the blacksmith's wife, who remained the town's most reliable accidental source of information, made a cash purchase at the land office. Nothing in the public record explained where that cash had come from. Elena put that alongside the tally sheet. She put it alongside the timing. The fence cuts had started 6 days after Adelaide had made a pointed comment at the Saturday market. The feed supplier's rate change had happened 2 days after Mabel Crow's Wednesday tea, which Adelaide always attended. It still wasn't enough. What she needed was someone who'd been paid and was willing to say so, and those people were, by definition, the hardest kind to find. The break came from an unlikely direction, which was how breaks usually came. Pete, who had been patching the barn roof section by careful section through the latter half of the summer, came down from the roof one afternoon with the expression of a man who'd been sitting with something long enough that it had gotten too heavy to hold. He found Elena at the fence near the south pasture and stood there for a moment in the way that meant he wanted to talk but wasn't sure how to start. "Say it," she said. "I know one of the men who cut your fence," Pete said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at his hands. "Not a friend," he said quickly. "A man I knew in Dalton before I came here. He drifts, takes work where he can find it. I saw him in town 2 weeks back and didn't think much of it. Yesterday I ran into him again near the East Road, and he had the look." Pete paused. "You know the look. Man who's done something and is thinking about whether he needs to leave fast." "Did you talk to him?" "Some." "Did he tell you who hired him?" Pete's mouth tightened. "Not in so many words. But he mentioned a name when he was being careless. Said he'd been recommended to the job by someone connected to a woman in town. Said she'd paid 3 men for the fence work and the cattle, and there was supposed to be more, but something fell through." He stopped. "He mentioned the Foss widow." Elena stood very still. He didn't know I was working here, Pete said. If he had, he wouldn't have said it. He's not a smart man. He looked up. I should have come to you sooner. I kept thinking it was just talk. Does he know you made the connection? No. Is he still in the area? As of yesterday. Elena nodded slowly. She said, I need you to find him again. Not confront him. Just find him and let me know where he is. Can you do that? Pete looked uncomfortable. He's not going to talk to you. He might, she said, if he understands what happens to men who take money to steal cattle in this county. The minimum is 5 years. A man who cooperates tends to serve considerably less. Pete looked at her. You sound like you know that for certain. My father had a lawyer he respected, she said. I paid attention. That night she sat at the table long after Colt had gone to sleep and wrote down everything she had. The paper, the timing, Adelaide's unexplained cash, the fence cuts, the supplier pressure, the hired drifter, Pete's account. Written out and laid next to each other, it was a coherent picture even without a single piece that was sufficient on its own. She folded the pages and put them with the tally sheet. She brought it to Colt in the morning. He read it twice. He sat with it. She poured coffee and didn't speak because he needed to think without her pushing him toward the conclusion she'd already reached. We need to find that man before he leaves the county, Colt said. Pete's looking. He looked at her. You already asked him. Last night. He put the papers down. Elena. I know, I should have talked to you first. That's not... He stopped, started again. I'm not angry about the sequence. I just want you to know you don't have to carry this by yourself. She looked at him for a moment. The mornings had gotten easier between them, in the way that shared work and shared difficulty had a way of making things easier without ceremony. I know that now, she said. I didn't know it 2 months ago. He nodded. He picked up his coffee. What do you need from me? Don't go into town about this yet. If Adelaide hears we're asking questions, her man will be gone before we can get to him. She paused. And I need to know if there's anyone in the county seat you trust, a lawyer, a land agent, someone in the recorder's office. If she used cash to buy land, there's a record. There's a man named Aldrich, Colt said. He handled my deed when I bought the place. He's careful. Not cheap, but careful. Can you write to him today? Already thinking it, Colt said. Teat. The windstorm came at the end of August with 3 days of warning and 1 night of catastrophe. The warning signs were the kind that old ranchers read without thinking about it. The particular color of the afternoon sky 2 days before, brownish yellow at the horizon. The way the cattle bunched tight in the south pasture without being herded. The smell of the air, dry and electric, that made the horses restless in their stalls. Webb noticed it first and said so at dinner 2 nights before it hit. Bad one coming, he said. I've seen that sky before. We should move anything loose. They spent the following day securing what they could. The barn doors were braced. Equipment was moved inside. The patches Pete had made on the roof were reinforced with additional bracing from below. The horses were brought in early and settled, which took longer than usual because Ghost and 2 of the others were already picking up whatever signal was in the air and didn't want to be enclosed. Elena talked Ghost in. It took 40 minutes of patience and a calm voice discussing nothing, and by the end of it she had a headache from the tension in the air, and her hands were shaking slightly from the sustained effort of being steady when everything in her wanted to hurry. She got the mare into the stall and latched it and stood outside for a moment with her back against the barn wall, eyes closed. She heard Pete behind her. You all right? Fine, she said. Just tired. Storm's not here yet, and you're already tired, he said, not unkindly. That's not a good sign. Thank you, Pete. I found him, by the way, Pete said. Your fence cutter. He's staying at the Kellerman boarding house, north side of town, room 4. She opened her eyes. How long will he stay? Hard to say. He's not a man who plans more than a day ahead. Pete paused. I also found out something else. He has a friend who did the cattle job with him. The friend is nervous, talking more than he should. Talking to who? Whoever will listen, mostly, but some of it has gotten to people who know people. Pete shrugged. Word travels. Elena pushed off the wall. We need to move on this before the storm. Storm's going to hit tonight, Pete said. Tomorrow or the day after? I know, I need to talk to Colt. She found him checking the bracing on the north pasture gate with Cal and Marcus, all three of them working in the thickening wind that had started as a breeze and was building with a purpose that was becoming harder to ignore. She told him what Pete had said in the compressed, practical way she'd learned was most useful with Colt. Facts in sequence, conclusion at the end. We need someone to go into town tonight, she said, before the storm. Get to the county deputy, show him what we have, and get him out to the boarding house before that man decides the weather is a good time to disappear. Colt looked at the sky. The afternoon light had gone wrong in the way Webb had described, that brownish edge bleeding in from the west. Tonight is bad timing, he said. I know, but if we wait, we lose him. Colt thought about it for a moment. He looked at Cal. You feel comfortable riding to town in what's coming? Cal looked at the sky the way a man looks at something he's already calculated. I've ridden in worse, he said. If I leave in the next hour, I can get there before it's bad. Take Pete, Elena said. He knows the man's face. All right, Colt said. They were saddling the horses when the first hard gust came through the yard, taking a loose board from the woodpile lean-to and spinning it 20 feet. Elena caught it before it hit the fence. Her hands were still shaking slightly, which she ignored. Cal and Pete rode out at 4 in the afternoon. By 5, the sky was the color of a bruise. Oh, the fire started at the eastern end of the bunkhouse, which was the worst possible location, close to the hay storage, upwind of the barn. Webb smelled it first. He came out of the main house at a run shouting, and Elena was already moving before she was fully awake, pulling on her boots in the dark with the smell of smoke reaching her through the window she'd left open for the heat. By the time she was in the yard, the bunkhouse wall was orange, and the wind, which had built through the night into something that bent the mesquite flat and drove the dust horizontal, was pushing the fire sideways toward the barn. Colt was there with a bucket before she was. Samuel Holt and Marcus Dawes were out of the bunkhouse, coughing, both of them intact. Webb was working the pump. Where's Webb's room? Elena shouted to Marcus over the wind. He made it out, Marcus shouted back. But he went back in, Marie. He said the foreman... She didn't wait for the rest of the sentence. She pulled her jacket up over her face and went in through the bunkhouse door. The interior was bad. Not fully involved yet. The fire was eating along the wall and had gotten into the roof boards, but the center of the room was still navigable if she moved low and fast. She found Webb at the far end, trying to drag a man she recognized as an older ranch hand named Sorrel, who'd come on 2 weeks ago and who apparently slept heavily enough that the noise hadn't woken him. Sorrel was awake now, dazed and coughing, and Webb had him by the arm but was struggling because Sorrel's legs weren't cooperating. Elena got under Sorrel's other arm and they moved. It was maybe 30 seconds from the far end of the bunkhouse to the door, and it felt considerably longer. The heat was pushing down from the roof boards, and the smoke was thick enough that she couldn't see across the room. She kept her eyes on the door, which was a rectangle of marginally clearer air, and she moved toward it. They came out into the yard and the wind hit them, which in the moment felt like a good thing because wind was air, but then she heard the sound from the south, a low rolling sound beneath the storm noise. And she understood what was happening before she'd fully processed that she was out of the building. The cattle. The south pasture gate had come open. She could see it, swinging in the wind 30 yards away, the latch torn loose. The herd was moving, panicked by the fire and the storm, and they were moving south, which was the direction of the canyon drops. 300 yards of open pasture, and then the ground fell away in 2 places where the land broke into gullies deep enough to kill an animal going fast. Colt saw it at the same time. He started toward the horses, and she grabbed his arm. "Webb," she said. "Sorrel's hurt. Webb needs help." Colt looked at her, then at the moving herd, then back. She could see him calculating the distances, the numbers, the time. She could see him knowing what she knew. One man on one horse in this wind, in this dark, couldn't turn a panicked herd on his own. "I'll go," she said. "Elena." "I have a different idea," she said. "Give me 5 minutes." She didn't wait to find out if he agreed. She was already running toward the far side of the barn, where the controlled burn pile was, dry brush and wood scraps they'd been meaning to clear, sitting in a cleared patch of dirt 30 feet from the barn wall, downwind. She grabbed a lantern from the barn hook on her way past, already lit from the fire's borrowed light. The idea was not a good idea in the way that careful plans were good. It was the kind of idea that came from understanding one thing clearly. You could not outrun a panicked herd in the dark. You could not turn them from behind. But cattle moved away from fire, and the fire was behind them, and if she could get fire in front of them, between them and the canyon drops. She touched the lantern to the brush pile. It went up faster than she'd expected, which was the wind's doing. The brush pile exploded into a wall of orange in the seconds after the flame caught, and she had to step back fast, her jacket sleeve catching a spark that she beat out against her leg without stopping. She moved laterally, pulling burning branches with the hooked end of a fence tool, dragging the fire's line westward, trying to create a barrier rather than a point. The wind was pushing the fire the direction she needed it to go, but also the direction she didn't need it to go. And the difference between those two things was about 8 feet in her own body, because she was working inside the fire's edge and pulling pieces of it where she needed them. She couldn't see the herd clearly through the smoke and the dark and the wind-blown dust. She could hear them, a low thundering that was more felt than heard, and she could see the shapes of them changing direction as the fire's light reached them, the lead animals shying hard left, away from the brightness, pulling the herd's momentum with them. She pulled another burning branch. The smoke was in her eyes and her lungs and her throat. She lost track of direction for a moment, a bad moment, the kind where you understand that you are standing inside a fire in a windstorm at night and your sense of which way is safe is no longer reliable. She went down on one knee. Lower was better. She could see ground, and she followed the ground away from the brightest orange, keeping low, moving by feel more than sight, until the heat behind her decreased to merely terrible, and the smoke thinned by 1 degree, and she could hear the cattle more clearly. Further, moving away from her, away from the drops. She made it to the cleared ground near the north fence and stayed on one knee for a long moment, coughing, her eyes streaming. Her jacket was scorched along the left sleeve, and there was a burn on the back of her left hand she couldn't assess in the dark. Her throat felt like she'd swallowed gravel. The fire she'd lit was burning itself out at the pasture's edge, starved of fuel where the cleared ground began. The cattle had turned. She could hear them settling, not calm. Animals didn't go calm fast after something like this, but moving in the direction of the far fence rather than the canyon drops. She sat down completely, which was not something she'd planned to do. Her legs just made the decision on their own. She sat in the dirt at the edge of the north fence with the windstorm still going overhead and the remains of the bunkhouse still burning across the yard, and she stayed there until she could breathe without coughing, which took longer than she would have preferred. She didn't know how long she'd been gone from the yard. She didn't know if Colt had seen her go into the smoke. She didn't know yet if it had worked, whether the cattle were truly turned or just temporarily confused. She would find all of this out in the next few minutes when she stood up and walked back. She made herself stand. Her legs were steady enough. Her hand hurt. She walked back toward the yard. The first person she saw was Samuel Holt, who took one look at her and said in a voice that was very young suddenly, "We thought you were gone." "I'm not gone," she said. He looked at her burned sleeve, at her face, at whatever her face was showing. "You don't look—" "Go find Webb," she said. "Tell him the cattle turned. Tell him I need to know if Sorrel's all right." Samuel went. She kept walking toward the yard where the fire was lower now, and the men were moving with the particular exhausted purposefulness of people who had been managing a crisis for long enough that their bodies had stopped asking questions and were just doing what needed doing. She was still here. Everything hurt, and the storm was still blowing, and in the morning there would be damage to assess and a bunkhouse to mourn and a burned hand to deal with, and somewhere in town Cal and Pete were either finding the man who could confirm what she'd put together, or they weren't. She was still here. That would have to be enough for tonight. Colt found her at the north fence. She heard him before she saw him, his boots on the dry ground, moving fast, and then slowing when he spotted her walking toward the yard. He closed the distance in a few long strides and stopped 2 feet away, looking at her face, her jacket, her hand. He didn't say anything immediately, which with Colt meant he was feeling something he hadn't finished organizing yet. "I'm all right," she said. "You went into the smoke." The cattle needed to turn. "Elena." His voice had something in it she hadn't heard before. Not anger. Anger she knew how to navigate. Something rawer than that. I didn't know where you were for 20 minutes. Webb thought you'd gone down inside the fire. I didn't. I can see that. He looked at her hand, at the burn on the back of it that had blistered in a line from her knuckle to her wrist. That needs to be cleaned. I know, in a minute. Now, he said, and it wasn't a command exactly, but it wasn't a request either, and she was tired enough that she let him lead her back to the house without arguing about it. He cleaned the burn with steady hands, working carefully with water and cloth and the small tin of salve Webb kept in the kitchen cabinet for exactly this kind of thing. She sat at the table and let him work. The wind outside had dropped from catastrophic to merely persistent. Through the window, she could see the men moving in the yard, lanterns swinging, assessing the bunkhouse damage with the grim practicality of people who needed to know what they had left. The cattle turned, she said. I know. Cal got back an hour ago. He and Pete rode through the worst of it. He told me what he found in town. Colt didn't look up from her hand. They got to the boarding house. The man was there. Pete vouched for the deputy's approach and the man talked. Elena went still. He confirmed it. Adelaide Foss hired him directly, paid in cash. Him and 2 others for the fence work, him alone for helping move the cattle. Colt finished with the salve and pressed a clean cloth over the burn. He gave the deputy a written statement because Pete told him what the alternative looked like. Elena let out a breath she'd been holding for longer than one night. The deputy is going to Adelaide's house in the morning, Colt said. He said to tell you he'd want the tally sheet and your written account. I have them. I know you do. He looked at her then, directly, and there was the rawness again in his expression, the thing he hadn't finished sorting out. You've had them for weeks. You've been building this case for weeks, on your own, at night, while also fixing the pump and the fence and the pasture and everything else. Someone had to. I could have helped. You had enough to carry, she said. He held her gaze. That's not your call to make alone. She looked back at him. He wasn't wrong. She knew he wasn't wrong, and she also knew herself well enough to understand that carrying things alone was a habit so old she didn't always notice when she was doing it. Her father had been sick for 2 years before he died, and in those 2 years she'd told almost no one, because telling people felt like asking for something, and asking for something had always felt like confirming that she didn't have enough on her own. You're right, she said. It cost her something to say it plainly, without qualification. I should have brought you in earlier. Colt held the cloth against her hand for a moment longer. Then he said, You saved several hundred head of cattle tonight by walking into a fire in a windstorm. I had an idea. It was a terrible idea, he said. That worked. Most of my ideas are like that. Something shifted in his face, and there it was. The thing that wasn't quite a smile but lived in the same territory. She'd seen it a handful of times in the weeks since she'd come here, and each time it surprised her slightly because on a face that was mostly serious, it landed with unexpected weight. Get some sleep, he said. Tomorrow's going to be long. He wasn't wrong about that either. But the morning after the storm arrived gray and still, with the particular quiet that follows violence. The bunkhouse was a partial ruin, the eastern wall and roof section gone, the western portion still standing but smoke-damaged and structurally questionable. The hay storage had taken heat damage but hadn't fully caught, which was the night's luckiest development. The barn was intact. The main house was intact. The cattle were in the far north pasture, unsettled but whole. Sorrel's right ankle was broken. He'd fallen in the confusion of the evacuation, and Webb had carried him the last several yards out of the bunkhouse, which explained why Webb was moving stiffly this morning and wouldn't admit why. Elena told him she'd noticed, and he said he was fine, and she said she believed him the way she believed the pump was fine before she'd taken it apart, which made him exhale through his nose in a way that was as close to an admission as she was going to get. They counted losses by mid-morning. The bunkhouse would need to be substantially rebuilt. A section of the south pasture fence had gone down in the wind and would need immediate repair. 3 pieces of equipment stored in the lean-to had been damaged beyond easy use. Against that, the cattle were uninjured, the barn was intact, and the water channel was undamaged. We can rebuild the bunkhouse, Elena said to Colt, looking at the damage in the morning light. If we pull the usable lumber from the standing section, and get supply from the merchant in the East Town. We can have a working structure inside 3 weeks. 3 weeks the men sleep where? I'll move into the tack room. Webb can have my room. The others can take the main house floor. It's summer. It's warm enough. She looked at him. Unless you have a better idea. I don't, he said. I just want you to know you don't have to give up your room. It's a room, she said. It's not a sacrifice. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she'd stopped trying to fully read, because the full reading of Colt Mercer's expressions was a project that would take considerably longer than 3 months, and she had more pressing business at the moment. The deputy arrived at midday. His name was Harlan Cross, a lean, deliberate man in his 40s with a careful way of moving that suggested he'd learned not to hurry into situations without understanding them first. He came with a younger man whose name Elena didn't catch, and they tied their horses at the fence and came to the house and sat at the kitchen table where Elena laid out everything she had. The tally sheet first, smoothed flat on the table, the FOS visible in the water-stained handwriting at the top. Then the written account she'd compiled. Dates, sequences, the timing correlations she'd noticed between the Wednesday teas and the coordinated pressure on the ranch's suppliers and neighbors. The note from Pete about the drifter he'd recognized. The account of the east boundary tracks. The land office purchase that didn't fit Adelaide's stated means. Deputy Cross read through it without interruption. He went back to the tally sheet twice, holding it toward the window light. He read the written account once through and then returned to 2 specific pages. The land purchase, he said. How did you establish this? I asked Colt to write to the man who handled his deed at the county seat, Elena said. A man named Aldrich. He confirmed there was a cash purchase on record in Adelaide Foss's name made 7 weeks ago. The amount was consistent with the sum you'd need to pay 3 men for fence cutting and cattle theft over a period of months, with something left over. That's inference, Cross said. Yes, Elena said. The drifter's statement is not inference. Cross looked at her steadily. You know that statement on its own is one man's word against a property-owning widow. I know, Elena said, which is why I'd suggest you ask the man's companion, the one Pete described as nervous and talking too much, before he decides the valley is no longer comfortable. Cross was quiet for a moment. You've thought this through. I've had time, she said. He gathered the papers carefully, treating them with the specific respect of a man who understood that paper was frequently the only thing standing between a story and a conviction. He said he would be in contact within the week. He said not to discuss the contents of this conversation with anyone in Harlan's Crossing who wasn't already aware of it. He looked at Colt when he said this, and then at Elena, and the look was the kind that meant he was assessing whether the people in front of him could follow instructions under pressure. We'll wait, Colt said. Cross nodded. He and his younger companion left. Elena stood at the door and watched them ride out and felt, for the first time in weeks, that the weight she'd been carrying had been handed to someone whose job it was to carry it. It didn't feel like relief exactly. It felt like putting down something heavy and noticing your hands were still shaped around the thing that was no longer there. The waiting was harder than the work had been. She had plenty to occupy herself. The bunkhouse reconstruction, the south fence, the continued rotation of cattle through the north pasture. But the case against Adelaide Foss existed now in someone else's hands, and in that gap, her mind found time to run over everything she'd built, looking for the weak points, cataloging the places where the chain of evidence was held together by reasoning rather than documentation. Cross came back on the 5th day. He didn't come alone. With him was a man from the county sheriff's office, older than Cross, with the bearing of someone who handled things at a level above routine deputy work. They sat at the table again, and this time the conversation was shorter because most of the ground had been covered, and what Cross had to say landed in the kitchen with the specific weight of things that had been decided. The nervous companion had talked, not in Pete's second-hand way, but formally, to Cross and a witness in writing. His account matched the drifters in every material particular and added 2 details that Elena hadn't known. Adelaide Foss had not acted alone, and the bunkhouse fire had not been planned by her. Mabel Crow had brought the money for the fire. Elena sat with that for a moment. Cross was watching her. Mabel, Colt said flatly beside her. The companion states that a woman matching her description, He didn't know her name. He was hired through an intermediary, provided additional funds specifically for what he called a final discouragement. He understood this to mean property damage significant enough to make continued operation of the ranch non-viable. Cross paused. He says he didn't know anyone would be in the bunkhouse. Whether that's true or a convenient thing to say now, I can't tell you. Where are they now? Elena asked. Mabel and Adelaide. Adelaide Foss was spoken to this morning, Cross said. She denied the initial questions and then, when presented with the written statements, stopped speaking and asked for time to consult with her attorney. He paused. Mabel Crow presented a different challenge. She left Harlan's Crossing 3 days ago. Her housekeeper said she'd gone to stay with a sister in the east. She knew, Elena said. She knew before the fire. She knew it was going to happen. That's the inference, yes, Cross said. We'll find her. Can you? Colt asked. And it wasn't skepticism exactly, more the flat question of a man who'd lived long enough to know that the distance between what the law could do and what it actually did was sometimes considerable. We can extradite from most territories, the man from the sheriff's office said. It was the first time he'd spoken, and his voice had the texture of someone used to being listened to. If she's with family, she won't be hard to locate. She's a widow with property and standing. She's not a woman who knows how to disappear. Colt absorbed this. Elena watched him do it, watched him work through the same calculation she'd already run. Not a perfect outcome, not a swift one, but a real one. The machinery was in motion. It would move at its own speed. What do we do in the meantime? Colt asked. Nothing, Cross said. Let it proceed. Don't go to Adelaide's property. Don't make statements in town about the case. If people ask, and they will ask, you tell them it's a matter for the law and you're cooperating with the investigation. He looked at Elena specifically when he said this, which she understood. She was the one people in Harlan's Crossing would push. She was the one who would be asked, implied at, speculated about in her presence. And she was the one whose response would set the tone for how the town processed what was coming. I understand, she said. Cross stood. He shook hands with Colt and then, after a slight pause, with Elena. His grip was firm and brief. You did good work here, he said, with the restraint of a man who didn't give that kind of statement casually. I just paid attention, she said. He nodded, like that confirmed something he'd already thought, and left. The town found out the way towns always found out. Not all at once, but in pieces, each piece arriving slightly wrong and then being corrected and then being embellished and corrected again, until what emerged was something that approximated the truth without being entirely it. What people understood within a week, Adelaide Foss had hired men to cut fences and steal cattle from the broken spur. Mabel Crow had financed the fire. Both women had coordinated pressure on suppliers and neighbors to isolate the ranch. The campaign had run for months. It had been planned and paid for and executed with the specific intent of driving Elena Ashcroft away from Harlan's Crossing and from Colt Mercer's ranch. The reaction in town was not uniform, because reactions in small towns never are. Some people were genuinely shocked. Some people had suspected something was wrong but hadn't known it was this organized. Some people had participated in the social machinery, the Wednesday teas, the whispered narratives, the careful erosion of Elena's standing, without ever calling it what it was, and these people now had to decide what to do with that understanding, which was uncomfortable enough that several of them found it easier to redirect their discomfort toward Adelaide and Mabel, and away from themselves. Garvey, the feed merchant who had raised the Broken Spurs rates at Adelaide's encouragement, came to the ranch on a Tuesday with his hat in his hands and an expression of considerable discomfort. He asked to speak with Colt. Colt brought Elena. Garvey looked at her for a moment, then at Colt, and said, I owe an apology to both of you. I was told things about the situation out here that I should have questioned, and I didn't question them because it was easier not to. He paused. I'd like to return to your previous rate and make up the difference for the weeks I charged you more, if you'll let me. Colt looked at Elena. The previous rate is fine, Elena said. Keep the difference. Put it toward something useful. Garvey looked uncertain, like he'd been prepared for harder terms and didn't know what to do with easier ones. He put his hat back on and said he was grateful and rode back to town. You could have taken the money, Colt said, after Garvey was gone. I know, Elena said, but I don't want this whole thing to end up being about money. That's what they thought it was about from the beginning. Colt considered this. Fair, he said. Birch, the sheep rancher who'd moved his fence line to close the Broken Spur's access trail, came 2 days after Garvey. He didn't offer money, and he didn't make a speech. He just said he'd be moving the fence back and that he was sorry for the inconvenience. His manner was the slightly rigid manner of a man performing a duty he found uncomfortable, but he performed it, which Elena thought was worth something, even if it wasn't worth everything. The neighbor who'd closed the shared water point sent a note rather than coming in person. The note was brief and formal. Elena read it and filed it and moved on. Not everyone came. Reardon, who had warned the prospective ranch hands away from Broken Spur, sent nothing and appeared at the Saturday market the following weekend with the careful blankness of a man hoping not to be directly addressed. The cluster of women who'd attended the Wednesday teas and laughed at the right moments and passed the right stories along found various ways to be busy and unavailable. The town's adjustment was real but partial, which was what real adjustments looked like, as opposed to the kind in stories. Adelaide Foss's attorney negotiated her circumstances with the sheriff's office over the following 3 weeks. The outcome was not a trial, or not yet a trial. There were property attachments, legal proceedings of a complexity that Elena tracked through Aldrich at the county seat, and a formal acknowledgement in writing that Adelaide had employed men to commit theft and property destruction. Whether prison was the eventual result depended on variables that moved at the speed of county law, which was not fast. Mabel Crow was found with her sister 7 days after Cross said they'd find her. She returned to Harlan's Crossing under circumstances that the town described in various ways depending on who was describing them, but that amounted to, she came back because she had no real choice. And she faced what was waiting with the tight-jawed composure of a woman who had decided that composure was the only thing left that was entirely her own. Elena did not go to watch. She had work to do. What she did do, on the evening of the day she heard Mabel was back, was sit at the kitchen table long after dinner with a cup of coffee and a kind of quiet that wasn't emptiness but its opposite. A full quiet, the quiet of something that had been running hard finally allowed to slow. Colt sat across from her. He'd been there for a while, not talking, which was fine because the not talking between them had become a different kind of thing from what it had been in the early weeks. Less careful, less managed. It's not over, she said. Adelaide's case is still in process. Mabel's situation isn't resolved. There are neighbors who haven't said anything. No, Colt agreed. The bunkhouse isn't finished. The south fence has 2 sections that need replacing before winter. We're still 2 hands short of where we should be heading into the fall work. All true. She turned the coffee cup in her hands. I just want to be clear that I know all of that. I know you know, Colt said. She looked at him. The lamp was low and the kitchen was warm, and outside the north pasture was dark and full of cattle that were alive because of a fire she'd lit in a windstorm at night, which remained the strangest thing she'd ever done. The tally sheet, she said. The partial word at the top. I knew it was Foss the first night I found it. I was almost certain. I figured, Colt said. I should have told you sooner. You told me when you had enough to do something with, he said. I understand why. He paused. I'm learning that you don't talk until you're sure. I'm learning to wait for that. She looked at him for a moment. That's a patient thing to learn. You're worth being patient about, he said, in the plain way he said things, without decoration, which was the way that hit hardest. She didn't answer that directly. She looked at her coffee and thought that she had never in her life expected to be somewhere she fit, and that fitting somewhere turned out to feel less like arrival and more like the slow accumulation of days in which you were present and accounted for, and nobody asked you to be less than you were. It wasn't perfect. The coffee was good now, but the pump would need attention again before spring. Sorrel's ankle would heal, but slowly. The bunkhouse was half a shell. There were legal proceedings grinding along at the speed of legal proceedings, and neighbors who'd behaved badly and hadn't accounted for it yet. But the cattle were alive. The north pasture was green, and the people in this kitchen had been honest with each other through worse things than most people in Harlan's Crossing would ever be asked to face together. She finished her coffee and stood up and said she was going to check the south fence before dark. Colt said he'd come with her. They went out into the evening together, which was not a dramatic thing, was not a thing anyone in town would have seen or noted or reported, was simply two people walking out to check a fence at the end of a long day on a ranch that was battered and imperfect and slowly, stubbornly coming back to life. The south fence held through autumn. It was the kind of small, undramatic victory that nobody outside a working ranch would understand the significance of. A fence that held, cattle that stayed where they were supposed to stay, a water channel that kept running through the first cold weeks, when the ground hardened and lesser repairs cracked and failed. Elena walked that fence line on a gray October morning with her hands in her jacket pockets and the burn scar on her left hand pale and tight in the cold, and she felt something she didn't have a precise word for. Not pride exactly. Something quieter. The satisfaction of a thing done right that was still being right 3 months later. The bunkhouse was finished by the second week of September. Pete had done most of the structural work, with Marcus and Samuel on the heavy lifting, and what emerged was not identical to what had burned, but was better in two specific ways. The flue was properly built this time, and the eastern wall was framed with an extra foot of clearance from the hay storage. Elena had insisted on that second thing over Pete's mild objection that it would cost them 8 extra feet of usable storage space, and Pete had conceded after she'd pointed out that 8 feet of storage space was worth considerably less than a bunkhouse that didn't burn. Sorrel's ankle healed crooked. The physician who came out from the county seat looked at it and said it had been set adequately under the circumstances, but that there was nothing more to be done now, that the bone had knit the way it wanted to. Sorrel walked with a slight hitch after that, not severe enough to stop him working, but present, always present, a reminder of one August night that nobody at the Broken Spur needed reminding of. He didn't complain about it. He was not a man who complained about things, which Elena respected even as she noticed that he never walked past the rebuilt bunkhouse without a specific quality of looking at it that was somewhere between gratitude and something harder to name. Adelaide Foss's legal situation resolved in November, after 3 months of the grinding process that Cross had warned them about. The resolution was not a prison sentence. Elena had understood by then that prison sentences for property crimes committed by women of standing in frontier counties were not the most common outcome, and she'd adjusted her expectations accordingly, which was its own kind of education in how justice actually functioned as opposed to how it was supposed to. What Adelaide received was a fine substantial enough to require selling parcels of her mortgaged land, a formal censure entered into the county record, and a requirement to make restitution to the Broken Spur for the documented losses from the cattle theft and the fire damage. Elena was present when Cross delivered the restitution payment. A bank draft, formal and impersonal, the law's way of translating harm into numbers. She took it, thanked Cross, and put it in the ranch ledger under the same column where she'd been tracking the losses. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt tired in a way that wasn't unpleasant, the way you felt tired after finishing something that had been genuinely hard. What she felt most clearly, sitting with the ledger that evening, was this. Adelaide Foss had spent months trying to prove that Elena Ashcroft was small, and in the process, Adelaide Foss had lost her land. There was a lesson in that. Elena thought about it for a while and decided the lesson was not about victory. It was about what happens when you mistake someone's quietness for weakness and build your strategy on that mistake. Adelaide had looked at a woman in patched clothes doing hard work that nobody else wanted, and she'd seen something disposable. She'd never looked hard enough to see what was underneath. That was Adelaide's failure, not Elena's. But Elena had spent enough of her life carrying other people's failures around like they belonged to her, and she was done with that. Mabel Crow's situation was different and harder and took longer. Mabel had returned to Harlan's Crossing in early October with the composure Elena had heard described by 3 separate people in 3 separate conversations, each of whom seemed faintly impressed by it, even as they condemned what had put her in the position of needing it. The legal case against Mabel was more complicated because the evidence connecting her specifically to the fire's financing was testimony from men who had every reason to spread responsibility as widely as possible, which Mabel's attorney argued with enough technical skill to slow the process considerably. What happened to Mabel was not what Elena had imagined in the early weeks when she'd been most angry. It was smaller and larger at the same time. The formal legal consequences, a lesser fine than Adelaide's, no restitution order because Mabel's attorney successfully distinguished her role from direct commission, were less than they should have been, which was a plain fact that Elena stated once to Colt and once to Cross, and then stopped stating because stating it a third time would only be for her own satisfaction, and her own satisfaction was not the same as justice. What happened to Mabel beyond the legal case was that the town turned, and when a small town turns on one of its own, the turning is total in ways that formal proceedings never quite are. The Wednesday teas stopped, not because anyone disbanded them. They simply stopped being attended one by one as women who had previously organized their social calendar around them discovered that association with Mabel Crow had become a liability. The merchants who had valued her custom continued to serve her because merchants serve people who have money, but they served her with a specific quality of neutrality that was more cutting than hostility because it meant she had ceased to matter. Elena watched this happen from a distance and felt complicated about it. She had no affection for Mabel Crow. She did not believe Mabel had been wrongly treated, but there was something about watching a person become irrelevant, watching the social architecture that had defined them simply withdraw its support and leave them standing in empty air, that was hard to feel purely good about. It was not a feeling she would have expected to have, and she held it honestly, because she'd found that the feelings you didn't expect were usually the ones most worth examining. She was at the Saturday market in early November when she saw Mabel for the first time since the investigation had concluded. Mabel was buying flour. She was alone. No housekeeper carrying the basket, no Adelaide at her elbow. She was dressed as well as she always had. Her clothes were fine, her posture was intact, but she had the look of a woman who had recently understood something she could not ununderstand. The look of someone who had believed that the world was organized in a particular way and had discovered it was organized differently. Mabel saw Elena. Their eyes met across the market stalls. Elena looked at her for a moment. She thought about the months, the fence cuts, the fire, the smoke in her lungs, the burn on her hand. She thought about Sorrel's crooked ankle. She thought about the Wednesday teas and every carefully delivered piece of information that had been designed to make her feel like less than she was. And then she looked away because she was done, and she had what she needed, and some understandings are complete without being spoken. She bought her salt and her coffee, and she went home. The wedding happened in December, which was not the most convenient time for a ranch wedding given the cold and the shortened days, but Elena and Colt had agreed on it in the practical way they agreed on most things. December was when the pressing work eased, when the cattle were settled and the repairs were done, and there was actual space in the calendar for something that wasn't an emergency. They did it at the ranch, not in town, which some people in Harlan's Crossing interpreted as a slight, and which Elena intended as nothing more complicated than, this is where we live, and this is where it should happen. Webb was there, Pete was there, Cal and Ira, Samuel Holt, who had become a reliable and genuinely good worker in the months since Elena had shown up at his father's door. Marcus Dawes, who still spoke rarely but worked hard and had developed a quiet loyalty to the Broken Spur that expressed itself in small, consistent acts rather than declarations. Sorrel walking with his new hitch. A handful of people from Harlan's Crossing who had navigated the preceding months carefully enough to have arrived at a place of genuine goodwill rather than performed goodwill. Thomas Holt and his wife, Deputy Cross and his, the merchant from the East Town who had given them fair prices without requiring an explanation. It was cold. Elena wore a dress she'd made herself from wool she'd bought in October, a dark green that she'd chosen because it was practical enough to wear again rather than because it was what a wedding dress was supposed to look like. Colt wore his good jacket and a clean shirt, and the expression of a man who had decided he was content, which on Colt's face looked like a specific kind of stillness that Elena had learned to read as something close to happiness. The ceremony was short. They had asked a justice of the peace from the county seat to come out and handle it, a dry-mannered man named Holt, no relation to Thomas, who performed the legal portion with efficient respect and then shook their hands and accepted the meal they offered and left before the gathering got too loud for his evident preference. After he left, the gathering did get somewhat loud, which was Webb's doing primarily, because Webb had brought a bottle of something he'd been keeping for an occasion and had decided this was the occasion. Cal turned out to play the harmonica, which nobody had known about and which produced a specific quality of surprised delight in the assembled group that Elena filed away as one of the things she hadn't expected from this life she was building. Colt sat beside her in the evening while the others talked and said, quietly enough that it was just for her, "You all right?" "Yes," she said. "That's not a performance?" She looked at him. "I don't perform things." "I know you don't," he said. "That's why I'm asking. Because if you're actually all right, I want to know it's real." She held his gaze. The fire was going, and the lamp was lit, and outside the night was cold, and the north pasture was dark and full of cattle that were hers now as much as his, not because of a piece of paper signed today, but because of months of daily choosing, months of showing up when staying away would have been easier. "I'm really all right," she said. "That's new information, by the way, in case you were wondering." Colt was quiet for a moment. Then, "I know." "You knew before I did, didn't you?" she said. "It wasn't quite a question." "Some of it," he said. "Not all of it." The cow played something slower on the harmonica, a quiet tune that settled into the room without demanding anything. Elena drank her coffee, which was good, had been good for months, would continue to be good, and let the evening exist without trying to manage it, which was its own kind of skill, and one she was still learning. The spring that followed was the first spring at the Broken Spur that felt like expansion rather than survival. The north pasture was fully operational by April, carrying a third of the herd through rotation that kept the grass recovering and the cattle gaining weight at a rate that Webb, checking his notes from the previous 2 years, said was the best he'd recorded. The water channel, Elena's first real contribution to the land itself, ran clean through the snowmelt and then the spring rains and kept the lower section green through weeks that would previously have dried it out. They hired 2 more hands in March, a man named Ferris who came from a failed homestead 2 counties over and worked with the grim dedication of someone who had learned not to take employment for granted, and a woman named Ruth, which surprised some people and didn't surprise Elena at all, who had experience with cattle from her family's operation in Wyoming, and who had applied for the position with the particular directness of someone who had been turned away from too many places and was done softening her approach. Elena had hired her on the spot, which had produced a silence from Ferris that was eventually replaced by the acknowledgement that Ruth did in fact know what she was doing, which was all Elena had required of him. By June, the Broken Spur was profitable for the first time in 3 years. Not extravagantly profitable. The frontier did not offer extravagant profitability to people who worked honestly, but sustainably, genuinely profitable, the ledger balancing in a way that allowed for maintenance and wages and a small reserve against the next bad winter that would come because bad winters always came. Colt showed her the ledger on a June evening with the same directness he brought to everything and said, "We did this." "We did," she said. "I want you to understand what that means," he said. "Not for the ranch. For me. 3 years ago, I thought this land was going to take everything I had and give nothing back. I thought I'd built something that was just going to—" He stopped. He was not a man who spoke easily about the interior of things, and she'd learned not to rush him through it. "I thought I'd made a mistake coming here, buying this land, putting everything I had into it." "Did you?" she said. "Make a mistake?" "No," he said, "but I didn't know that until you showed me." She looked at the ledger and then at him. "I didn't show you anything that wasn't already here." "The pump was broken," he said. "The pasture was dead. The horses were unmanageable, and the fence was failing, and I had 4 men who were running out of reasons to stay." He held her gaze. "You showed me it wasn't dead. You showed me it was just not being seen right." She thought about what to say to that and found, after a moment, that the honest answer was simple. "Someone showed me that once, about something I'd given up on. I was just passing it along." He looked at her. "Your father." "Yes." He nodded slowly. The understanding that passed between them wasn't complicated. It was just 2 people who had each lost something and had found unexpectedly that the thing they'd built together was worth more than what they'd mourned. The town's relationship with Elena changed in the way that real changes happen. Not all at once, not with a moment of dramatic recognition, but gradually, one interaction at a time, until the accumulated weight of the changed interactions became the new normal, without anyone having declared it so. Thomas Holt, at the Saturday market in July, introduced her to a man visiting from a neighboring county as Elena Mercer from the Broken Spur, with the casual assurance of a man introducing someone whose standing was understood. The introduction was unremarkable. It was, in its unremarkableness, everything. Garvey, the feed merchant, had added the Broken Spur to what he called his reliable accounts, which meant better rates and first access to supply when things were short, which in a drought year was the difference between managing and struggling. He told Elena this at the counter one morning, and she thanked him and did not reference the months when he'd raised their rates, because the past was the past, and what mattered was what you built from it. Deputy Cross came by the ranch in August, not on official business, just passing. He stayed for coffee and reported that Adelaide Foss had sold her remaining acreage and moved to live with relatives in another county, which he mentioned in the flat, informational way of a man filing a fact. Adelaide's house had been purchased by a young couple from back east who were trying to establish a small operation. Elena didn't know them yet. She would. Mabel Crow was still in Harlan's Crossing. She would probably always be in Harlan's Crossing because leaving would be an admission, and Mabel Crow was not constituted for admissions. She attended the smaller social functions that still included her. She kept her composure. She grew slowly and visibly old in the way that people grow old when the thing that animated them, the status, the social machinery, the sense of being the one who set the terms, is no longer available. Elena passed her occasionally and nodded and received a nod in return, and that was what their relationship was now, and it was sufficient. What Elena thought about Mabel in her private accounting was this. Mabel had spent her life organizing the world according to a hierarchy that put people like Elena at the bottom and people like herself at the top, and she had defended that hierarchy with everything she had because without it, she didn't know who she was. That was a terrible way to live. Elena did not feel sorry for Mabel, exactly, but she felt something, a recognition that cruelty of that specific kind came from a specific kind of fear, and that the fear was real even if the cruelty was not excusable. She kept this thought to herself. It wasn't the kind of thing you said out loud in a small town without it being misunderstood. The thing that changed Elena's standing in Harlan's Crossing completely and irrevocably, not the legal outcome, not the fire, not the rebuilt ranch, but the specific thing that landed differently, happened on a Wednesday afternoon in September, a year after she'd come to the Broken Spur. The Holt family's barn had collapsed, not from fire or sabotage, but from the simple accumulated failure of old wood and too many hard winters and a foundation that had been failing for longer than anyone had wanted to acknowledge. The collapse happened in the early morning before Thomas's son Samuel had gone to feed, which was luck of the kind that makes you stop and breathe for a moment before you start dealing with the practical reality. No one was hurt, but the barn was gone, and with it the family's ability to shelter their animals through the coming winter, and Thomas Holt stood in his yard looking at the pile of lumber that had been 30 years of work, and had the look of a man trying to find the bottom. Elena heard about it from Samuel, who rode out to the Broken Spur that afternoon because he'd been working there, and he didn't know what else to do with the information. He told her with the controlled expression of a young man trying not to show how frightened he was for his family. She went to find Colt. "The Holt barn's down," she said. He looked at her. He knew her well enough by now to hear what was under the statement. "What do you need?" "Pete. 2 days of his time, and whatever lumber we can spare from the supply we set aside for the south extension." Colt was quiet for a moment. The lumber she was referring to was material they'd budgeted for expanding the south pasture shelters before winter. Using it for the Holt's barn meant postponing their own project by at minimum 6 weeks. "We can get through winter without the south extension," Elena said. "The Holts can't get through winter without a barn." "I know," Colt said. He wasn't arguing. He was deciding. "Take Webb, too, and Cal. He's faster with a frame than Pete." "I know." "And I'll come Saturday," he said. "If we get the frame up in the first 2 days, we can close it in by the weekend." She looked at him. "You don't have to." "I want to," he said, simply, without performance. They went to the Holt place the next morning, Elena, Pete, Cal, Webb, and Samuel, who was so visibly relieved to have something to do with his hands that he worked through the first day without stopping except to drink water. Thomas Holt worked alongside them and said very little because some things were too large for the words available to ordinary conversation, and Thomas was a man who knew that. By Saturday afternoon, when Colt arrived with Marcus and Ferris and Ruth and the remaining lumber, the frame was up and square and true. They closed it in through Saturday and into Sunday morning, and on Sunday afternoon Thomas Holt stood inside a barn that smelled of new wood and shook Colt's hand and then Elena's, and he said, "I'll pay this back." "You already did," Elena said. "You hired a young woman nobody else would look at, and you trusted what she told you. That's worth more than lumber." Thomas Holt looked at her for a moment. He was not an emotional man in the way that men of his generation and circumstance tended not to be emotional in ways that showed, but something moved across his face that was genuine and unguarded, and he nodded, and that was the conversation. Word of the barn raising spread through Harlan's Crossing by Monday morning, because in a small town, acts of practical generosity travel as fast as acts of cruelty, and the town needed something to travel at that speed after the year it had been through. By Wednesday, 2 other families had come to the Broken Spur to ask if Elena could advise them on their water situations. One had a failing pump similar to the one she'd repaired in her first week. One had drainage problems on their lower pasture that were killing their winter grass. She sat with each of them at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. Good coffee, always good coffee now, and asked them questions and listened and told them what she thought. She charged the second family because they could afford it and because her time had value. She helped the first family for free because they couldn't and because some things you did without calculation. She tried to be honest with herself about which was which, and she didn't always get the balance exactly right, but she tried. By autumn, people in Harlan's Crossing were calling her Ellie, which was not her name, and which she corrected once and then accepted because the affection behind it was real, and some fights were not worth having. What she understood by then, what she understood in the specific way that you understand things not from being told them, but from living them until they become part of how you see, was this: belonging was not something that happened to you. It was not something the town bestowed or withheld based on your clothes or your money or your family name. She had watched people try to give her belonging as a gift, and she had watched them try to revoke it as a punishment. And neither the giving nor the revoking had ever been the thing that actually changed her circumstances. What had changed her circumstances was showing up, day after day, and doing the work that was in front of her, and being honest about what she knew and what she didn't know, and refusing to become smaller when people required it of her. That was not a comfortable lesson. It didn't comfort you on the days when the town's cruelty was fresh and immediate, and the work was hard, and you were tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. It didn't make the Adelaide Fosses of the world disappear, or the Mabel Crows irrelevant. What it did was give you something to stand on that nobody else had built, and therefore nobody else could take away. She thought about her father, who had taught her most of what she knew that was actually worth knowing, who had died in a 2-room house with nothing in the bank, and a daughter who had spent 2 years watching him diminish and had not known how to help except to be there. She thought about the fact that he'd never seen this. The ranch, the north pasture green in summer, the good coffee, the man she'd married who understood that honest partnership was more durable than any other arrangement 2 people could make. She wished he could have seen it. That was a wish that didn't go anywhere useful, but she let herself have it because some wishes were just the shape of love with nowhere to go, and denying them didn't make them smaller, just unacknowledged. On a September evening, a year and some months since she'd said yes at the livery door, she stood at the top of the north pasture slope and looked down at the water channel running clear and the grass green in the lower section and the cattle moving through the rotation that she'd designed from the memory of her father's 20 acres and the specific quality of dark soil she'd seen in a dead-looking field. Webb came and stood beside her. He had a habit of appearing at these moments without it being strange, which was something she'd come to appreciate about him. "You know what this looked like when I first came here?" she said. "Dead," Webb said. "Dead," she agreed. "Dry and dead and written off." Webb looked at the pasture for a moment. "Funny thing about this land," he said. "It doesn't give up. It just waits." She looked at the channel running clear. "I know," she said. "I've been counting on that." The valley was quiet around them. Below, in the yard, she could hear Colt moving, The familiar sound of his boots on the packed earth, the sound she'd learned to locate the way you learned to locate any sound that meant you were not alone in a place you'd decided to stay. She was not the girl everyone had laughed at anymore. She was not the girl at all. She was a woman who had fixed a pump and restored a pasture and walked into fire in a windstorm and built a case in secret and hired a woman named Ruth and helped raise a neighbor's barn and made the coffee good and learned, slowly and imperfectly and at considerable cost, that her own judgment was worth trusting. Harlan's Crossing would never be entirely what she wished it was. The valley would never be without its hard winters and failed crops, and people who looked at someone in patched clothes and decided they already knew what they were seeing. The ranch would always need more work than there were hours in the day, and some seasons would be bad regardless of how right you did things, and justice would always move slower and arrive more partially than the injury warranted. None of that was going to change. What had changed was her place inside it. Not because the town had finally decided she was worthy of belonging, because she had stopped asking the town to make that decision and had made it herself. She turned away from the pasture and walked back down toward the yard, toward the sound of Colt moving and the warm light coming from the kitchen window, and the work that would be waiting in the morning, the way it always was, the way it always would be. The forgotten girl was gone. In her place was a woman who knew exactly where she was and had chosen clearly and without apology to be exactly there. That was enough. It was finally more than enough.